Cool. So yeah, as Chris said, my name's Roddy. I'm kind of here to I'm kind of tell us a little bit like a story, how I uncovered some pretty cool things that you can do with the SwiftUI environment, and how I'm using it to speed up the development and the maintenance of my indie apps. So, like many of you, I work on a small handful of my own indie apps. On the left, we've got Circa, an app for people to create their bucket list, discover new goals using AI. In the middle, we've got Classifier, an app for collectors to track their physical collections and understand their collections using statistics. And then finally, we've got Space, an app for ceramic artists to accompany their work, including kiln firing, calculations, storing glaze recipes, project management, and a whole bunch of other cool things. Cool. So all three of the apps were created using SwiftUI. Being able to use SwiftUI on my indie apps has given me the time and the flexibility to experiment and learn more about the frameworks. And over the last year and a half, I've made some pretty cool discoveries just learning by myself on how I can better use the SwiftUI environment in my apps to speed up my development process. But before I get too technical, I just want to give everyone a quick TLDR of what the SwiftUI environment is. So the environment, it allows developers to pass data from a view to all of its child views instead of having to explicitly pass them between through initializers. However, if a child view depends on an environment value, it'll be redrawn every time that that value changes. So this is something that you always need to consider when you're deciding to use the environment. And when you create your own environment key, you have to specify a default value. This helps to prevent crashes in your app when you try to read the value. Unlike those of you who may have used environment objects, I know I've been hit by that many times. If you've used SwiftUI at all, you've almost certainly come across some of these SwiftUI environment values before. Here's just a small handful of the system provided keys that I use across my apps, although there's hundreds of more of them out there. But when it comes to creating your own environment keys, it only takes a few lines of code. Better still, those working with Xcode 16 and above, well, Xcode 16, can use the new entry macro, requiring just one line to get up and running. For each new environment key that you create, you'll need to specify a default value that will be used in the event that one is not set in the parent view. No matter how you decide to set up your environment keys, the usage remains the same. The value needs to come from somewhere. In this case, it's a state property, but it can be a property of an observable class, or it could be an entire class as well. We use the environment view modifier, specifying the environment key that we'd like to use is subscribed. And then our child view can read in that value using the environment property wrapper, and again, using that same user is subscribed key. We can then use it like any other immutable property in our view, and if the property is changed in the parent view, our child view will update automatically. If we don't set the environment value in our parent, it will just use the default value. Now, this was a super basic example. I just wanted to make sure everyone had the same foundational knowledge before we turn it up a notch. We can do so much more. So I mentioned at the beginning that I primarily work on 3 indie apps in my own time, and it's highly likely I'll end up creating more. But as I've added more and more apps to my portfolio, I've noticed how repeated tasks are a huge time sink, and they prevent me from working on more important things like new features. This is also the case when maintaining UI components across apps. When a new SwiftUI feature comes out, say at WWDC, and I want to update my app to use that new feature, I'd have to do it across all of my apps. So if I take a step back and I look at my apps, I'm actually reusing a lot of the same views. These could be entire screens. We've got the What's New screen, the paywall, iCloud sync status screen if we're using CloudKit, or even just smaller reusable components like buttons for async tasks, segmented controls, many other little things and pieces here and there. So let's take the paywall screen as an example. So earlier this year, I created a shiny new paywall for one of my apps, Circa. After putting it out in the world, I found that it's performing really well and is actually converting more users than the previous paywall. So I therefore wanted to actually replicate this with one of my other apps, Classifier. But if I were to copy and paste this code from Circa to Classifier, I'd be doubling the amount of maintenance in the future should I want to maybe change the layout or perhaps fix a bug. Now, I already have a shared package that I use between all of my apps. It's called App Deco Kit, named it after my little indie business App Deco Studio. I house a lot of reusable extensions and common code here that I use across all my apps. So this is the ideal location to move we'll call it the shareable paywall. So I've moved all of my new paywall code to App Deco Kit, but there's a problem. Circa has its own color themes, it's got its own fonts, button styles, you name it. My shared package has zero understanding of what any of these values should be, and we need essentially a way to inject all of these Circa specific attributes. And we can use a very familiar technique to do this, protocols. We can define a common interface, one for the theme, one for the fonts. I've omitted some of the colors and font weights here, but you get the picture. These protocols live in my shared package, so it's in scope for any of my shared components. There's no real set way to do this. You can adjust these protocols to however you would like to set up your colors and fonts. It's totally up to you. And those who have been involved with some larger code bases may look at this and think, hey, that looks very much like a design system. And it pretty much is. It can be as large or as small as you want it to be. The nice thing about design systems is that they're essentially building blocks and standards that keep the look of our apps consistent in themselves, while also giving us the power to share components and inject our own customization. To reduce some code complexities, I like to have both the theme and the font themselves live in a common class. I call this the app's DNA. We put the DNA on the main actor just because it's going to be used when the user interface is updating. And now we can set up our environment keys. However, there's actually one little problem that we need to solve. We need to provide a default value for this key. Otherwise, if we want to use SwiftUI previews in our shared package, our views will have no colors or no fonts. No problem. We can actually create a default class for our DNA protocol, as well as the same for the theme and the font. In both cases, I set it up using just system colors and system fonts, nothing too fancy. Like I said before, we're only going to be using this for the purpose of SwiftUI previews when we're working inside the package. So we need to make sure that we provide a default theme. Now let's take a step back into Circa. We can actually implement our protocols for both the theme and the font. For the colors, I'm pulling in the colors from my asset catalog. And then for the fonts, I'm using a custom font that I've already got set up in my code base. We can then implement the DNA protocol, set the defaults to our Circa theme and Circa font, and then finally, we can look to inject it into our app's code. We can now access our DNA in all of our views and all of our screens throughout the app, including any shared components that are coming from App Deco Kit. And now we have our paywall screen set up in the shared package. It's able to read in a theme and the fonts from Circa. So now we can reuse that same code in our other apps. It's a similar layout for both paywalls, but you'll notice that we're using different fonts, different colors, and also different button styles. Under the hood, it's all the same code. And now if I want to make a minor change or bug fix in the screen, I'm able to apply it towards both apps. So before I wrap up, there's just a few takeaways for this. So the SwiftUI environment is really powerful. There's so many potential use cases. So maybe the next time you're working on your app, consider if it's something that could actually live in the environment instead. You could even use the SwiftUI environment for mocking purposes during unit tests, or perhaps for injecting a network layer. For example, purchasing logic, that's another aspect that I have to handle with sharing the paywall. However, that's a completely separate presentation. But do take caution. Any views that depend on your environment value will be redrawn if that value changes. Ideally, the environment value shouldn't change often, if at all, such as a user subscription status like we talked about earlier, or the app's theme. So thank you. I hope you've been able to take away something from this pretty short presentation. If you want to connect afterwards, my socials are on screen on Mastodon and LinkedIn.